The Chinook lasted one day. She had been waiting for it since September. Not the way a person waits for rescue, but the way a builder waits for the single hour when the concrete can be poured. The waiting was precise. It had a schedule behind it, and materials stacked in order, and measurements taken in October that would be useless if the day never came. But the day would come. It had come every January for 3 winters in the Judith Basin, and Margaret Thornton had staked everything she had left on the fourth. She would tell you the story from the beginning, which was not January but April, which was the month the river took her husband and left her with a cabin that could not survive what was coming. Alistair Thornton died on a Thursday afternoon in April of 1866. He was working the cut bank on the Judith River, where the spring runoff had exposed a new face of clay and gravel, and the cut bank came down without warning at 3 in the afternoon, the way things happened in Montana Territory, which was without announcement and without apology. The land gave you what it gave you. It did not explain itself afterward. Margaret buried him beside the river on the flat ground above the cut bank, where the soil was deep enough for a proper grave and where the spring grass was already showing green through the brown of last year's growth. She dug the grave herself because there was no one else within 3 miles, and the 3 miles belonged to Duncan, Alistair's younger brother, and Duncan did not know yet. Duncan would not know until the following evening when Margaret walked the 3 miles east across the basin floor to his cabin and told him, and Duncan's face did something she had never seen a face do before, a kind of collapse that started in the eyes and moved downward, and she had looked away because the grief on Duncan's face was too close to her own, and she could not hold both. She sat beside the grave for 2 days. She did not cry during those 2 days, not because the grief was insufficient for crying, but because her mind was doing something else. Her mind was counting. It was counting the way her people counted when loss arrived, which was not counting what was gone, but counting what remained. The people of Tongue Parish in Sutherland had been doing this arithmetic for generations, the arithmetic of what is here, what is needed, what can be done. The clearances had taught them this. When the landlords burned the croft houses and drove the people to the coast, the people who survived did not sit in the ashes and list what they had lost. They stood on the coast and listed what they had: seaweed, stone, the skill in their hands, and they built from that. Margaret sat beside Alistair's grave and her mind counted firewood. On the first day, she calculated the winter. 6 months of cold from October to March, the stove running 14 hours a day at the rate she and Alistair had maintained for 2 winters, the rate that consumed approximately 1 cord of split pine every 3 weeks. 6 months was 8 cords, and the cutting and splitting of 8 cords was the work of 2 people through September and October, and now it was the work of 1. She could cut 8 cords alone. She had the arms for it and the knowledge. But the cutting was not the only work. There was the hauling from the draw, the splitting, the stacking, the feeding of the stove through the long nights. 2 people shared these tasks by instinct, one feeding the stove at midnight while the other slept, one hauling while the other split. The work of 2 people was not the work of 1 person done twice. It was a different kind of work entirely, and she sat beside the grave and understood this on the first day. On the second day, she counted the cabin itself, and the counting was worse. On the morning of the third day, she rose from the ground beside Alistair's grave and looked at the claim and the cabin and the land she had. She made the inventory that the widowed made, the inventory her mother had made when her father died, in the fishing at Tongue when Margaret was 23, the inventory that began with 3 questions and that did not include self-pity among the possible answers. What is here? What is needed? What can I do? She walked back to the cabin and stood at the door and looked at it as if she were seeing it for the first time, which in a sense she was, because she was seeing it now as the woman who would live in it alone, and alone changed what you saw. The cabin was a single-wall construction built in the summer of 1864 by Alistair and his brother Duncan from the draw timber on the claim. Pine logs 11 inches thick, notched and fitted at the corners in the flat notch style that was fast to build and adequate in the mild country they had left behind in the lower territories. 1 log thick, 11 inches of pine between the in body of the cabin and the outside air. In a country where the winter temperature dropped to 30 below zero and stayed there for weeks, 11 inches of pine was not a wall. It was a suggestion. It was a sentence started and not finished, and the winter read it and was not persuaded. She had spent 2 winters in this cabin with Alistair, and she had spent them cold. Not the cold of discomfort, The cold of a room that maintained 45 to 50 degrees on the worst nights, with the stove running at full rate and the woodpile diminishing at a speed that frightened her. She had watched the woodpile shrink through January and February with the specific attention of a woman who understood that firewood was not infinite and that the rate of consumption was not sustainable and that the problem was not the fire. The fire was doing everything a fire could do. The problem was the wall. She had said this to Alistair in February of 1866, 2 months before he died. They were sitting by the stove at 11 at night, the temperature outside at 28 below, the room at 47 degrees, and she had said what she had been thinking since the first winter. She said the wall is the problem. Cutting more wood is treating the symptom. The wall lets the heat out as fast as the stove puts it in, and no amount of wood changes that equation. Alistair had not agreed. He was a practical man in the way that practical men sometimes are, which was practical about the things he already knew how to do and resistant to the things he did not. He knew how to cut wood. He knew how to run a stove. He said the stove was too small, that a larger stove would solve the problem, that he would build a larger firebox in the summer. Margaret had known he was wrong, but she had not pressed the point because pressing the point was the same as saying, you built this cabin wrong, and Alistair had not built it wrong for the country they came from. He had built it wrong for this country, and the difference between those two statements was the difference between an insult and an observation, and she could not find the words that made the distinction clear enough. So she had let it go. She had let it go, and Alistair had died in April, and now she stood in the door of the cabin in September of 1866, knowing two things simultaneously. The first was that she had been right about the wall. The second was that being right gave her no satisfaction whatsoever, because the person she needed to convince was under the ground beside the Judith River, and the freedom to fix the wall had come at a cost she would not have chosen. She did not say this to anyone. She wrote it in the notebook she kept for the farm accounts, on the first page of the September entries, between the inventory of flour remaining and the count of fence posts that needed replacement. She wrote Alistair wanted to cut more wood. Alistair was wrong. I did not tell him clearly enough. Then she drew a line through the words with her pen, pressing hard enough to score the paper. But the ink was still legible beneath the line, and she did not tear out the page. She knew the answer to the wall. She had known the answer since she was 10 years old, standing in her father's house in Tongue Parish, on the northern coast of Scotland, asking her father a question about stone. The black houses of Sutherland were the traditional dwellings of the Highland Crofts. Low, long buildings with double walls of mortared stone, the cavity between the inner and outer walls packed tight with peat and turf and earth. The walls were 4 feet thick, from inside face to outside face, so thick that you could stand in the window opening without touching both sides. Margaret had been born in a black house in 1820 and had lived in it for 20 years until she married Alistair and moved to the adjacent township where she lived in another black house until 1864, when they came to Montana. 44 years in double-walled houses. 44 years of warmth that she had taken for granted. The way you take granted the ground beneath your feet, never asking why it holds you up simply walking. She had asked her father once. She was 10 years old and she had put her hand on the inside wall of the south room and felt that it was warm, and she had gone outside and put her hand on the outside wall and felt that it was cold, and she had come back inside and asked him why. Why was the inside warm when the outside was cold? The wall was stone. Stone was the same temperature on both sides of a thin wall. She had seen this at the harbor, where the thin stone walls of the fish sheds were cold on both sides in winter. Why was the black house different? Her father had taken her to the place in the west wall where a section of the interfacing stones had been removed for repair. The cavity was exposed, the dark mass of dry peat and compressed earth visible between the inner and outer stone courses. He pressed his hand into the cavity, filling his fingers, disappearing into the dry peat up to the second knuckle. He said, it is not the stone that keeps the cold out. The stone is too thin for that. He pulled his hand back and held a fistful of the dry peat and crumbled it between his fingers. He said the still air trapped in this filling cannot carry the cold through the wall. Moving air carries cold the way moving water carries silt by picking it up in one place and setting it down in another. Still air does not move. Still air does not carry. He held the crumbled peat up so she could see it, the dark fibers and the tiny spaces between them. He said, this is not the wall. This is what holds the air still. She was 10 years old and she understood it the way a 10-year-old understands, which was enough for the understanding and not enough for the building. She did not need to understand it more completely until 36 years later in September of 1866 in the Judith Basin of Montana Territory, when she stood at the wall of her single-skin log cabin and felt what was coming through it and knew exactly what to do. The cabin needed a second wall, an outer wall 4 to 8 inches outside the existing log wall, with the cavity between them packed tight with material that would hold the air still. The outer wall would take the wind and the first impact of the cold. The cavity would slow the transmission of the remaining cold through packed filling and the dead air trapped within it. The inner wall, the existing wall, would do only the final work of maintaining the room temperature against the much reduced cold coming through. This was the Black House. This was her father's house, built from different material in a different country, but the same wall. She did not have stone. She had logs. She did not have peat. She had grass. She spent the last week of September walking the claim and the creek drainage and the draw and the flat above the draw looking at what was available. She carried the farm notebook and she made a list. Timber in the draw adequate for a second outer wall of posts and rails and sheathing boards. She noted the species, the diameter, the distance from the cabin. She counted standing trees and estimated board feet and calculated the number of days required for felling and hauling. She examined the grass on the basin floor, the blue grama and the Idaho fescue, and the wheat grass that covered the flat in the annual cycle of growth and autumn dieback. The dried grass that was available in October in quantities that no single person could exhaust. She pulled a handful of dried grass from the ground and pressed it in her fist. Light, dry, fibrous, full of tiny spaces between the stalks. She squeezed harder and felt the grass compress and then resist the stalks pressing against each other in the way that her father's peat had pressed against itself in the Black House cavity. She opened her hand and looked at the compressed grass and knew that it would work. The grass would hold the air still. The air would hold the cold out. Duncan's claim was 3 miles east, and she was not going to ask Duncan for help. She had reasons for this that she could not have explained to anyone who asked, and no one asked, which was fortunate because the explaining would have been harder than the building. It was not that Duncan was unwilling. Duncan would have come immediately and worked without complaint and never mentioned it again. It was that asking Duncan was admitting she could not do it alone, and admitting she could not do it alone would confirm everything that Helen and Garner and the Reverend and the entire Montana Territory believed about a 46-year-old widow on a claim by herself. She would not give them that confirmation. She would give them a wall. But there was something else about not asking Duncan, something deeper, that she felt in the place below reasons. Duncan was Alistair's brother. Everything about asking Duncan for help felt like a kind of replacement that she could not describe precisely, but that she recognized the shape of a woman leaning on her dead husband's brother, because her dead husband was not there to lean on, and she was not going to become that shape. Not because there was anything wrong with leaning, but because she was not leaning, she was building. And building was not the same thing. Helen Thornton came in May, 3 weeks after the burial. Helen was Duncan's wife, a practical woman from the same parish in Sutherland, a woman who said what she saw and did not decorate it with softness when softness would obscure the point. She came with food and with a proposition. She said, "Margaret, come live with us. The cabin is not enough for one person alone through the winter. It was barely sufficient for two." Margaret said no. She said it simply and without explanation because she did not yet have the explanation ready. Only the answer. Helen looked at her the way Helen looked at things she disagreed with, which was directly and without pretending she agreed. Then Helen said the thing that Margaret could not answer. She said, "If you fall in the barn in January and break your leg, no one will know for a week. You will freeze to death on the barn floor, and we will find you in March. That is not courage, Margaret. That is arithmetic. One person 3 miles from help in 30 below zero. The arithmetic does not work." Margaret was quiet for a long time. She was quiet because Helen was right. Not right about leaving, right about the risk. The risk was real and it was not the cold. The cold had a solution and Margaret was going to build it. The risk was isolation. The cold could be engineered away. Being alone could not. If she fell, if she was injured, if the saw slipped or the horse kicked or the roof beam gave way, there was no second wall for that. She said to Helen, "I will think about it." Helen left with the expression of a woman who had heard, "I will think about it" before and knew what it meant. It meant no. But it meant a no that had heard the question, and Helen was practical enough to recognize that hearing the question was the first step in a direction she approved of, even if the steps were slower than she wanted. After Helen left, Margaret sat at the table with the notebook, and under the material calculations, she was already beginning to make for the outer wall. She wrote a single line. Problem Helen raises personal safety working alone. No solution yet. She did not cross this line out. She left it there between the timber count and the grass estimate, the one problem in the inventory that she had not solved. Thomas Garner came in June. Garner owned the ranch to the west, a spread 3 times the size of the Thornton claim, and he had been watching the claim since Alistair's death with the specific patience of a man who believed that time and winter would accomplish what persuasion could not. He rode over on a Tuesday morning with salt and flour tied behind his saddle, the gifts of a good neighbor, and Margaret accepted them because refusing salt and flour from a neighbor was a different kind of statement than she intended to make. They stood on the porch and talked about the weather and the grass and the early summer heat, and then Garner said what he had come to say. He said it the way he said everything, which was politely and with the appearance of a man who was offering something rather than asking for something. He said if she was considering selling the claim, he would pay a fair price. He said no one would blame her. No one would blame her. She heard the 5 words and understood everything they contained. The assumption that she would fail. The assumption that failure was not blame. The kindness that was also a verdict delivered in advance of the evidence. She heard it and she felt something move in her chest that was not anger and was not sadness, but was something adjacent to both the feeling of being predecided by a man who had never asked her what she was planning. She said, "Thank you, Mr. Garner. I am not selling." He nodded. He did not press. He said the offer stands through the fall. And he rode west with the easy posture of a man who had planted a seed and was content to wait for the season to do the growing. Through the fall, Margaret watched him ride away and understood the timeline he had set. He was not waiting for her to decide. He was waiting for the winter to decide for her. The first blizzard in November, the first week of 30 below. In December, the first morning she woke to 43 degrees in the cabin with the stove at full rate and the woodpile shrinking. He believed the winter would bring her to his door with the answer he wanted, and he was willing to be patient because patience cost him nothing and the winter was reliable. She turned from the porch and looked at the cabin, the logs 11 inches thick, the chinking between them already cracking from the summer dry, the single layer of pine that was all that stood between the inside of her life and the outside of the Montana winter. She thought about Garner's timeline, and she thought about her own. Garner's timeline ended when the winter broke her. Her timeline ended when the wall was finished. The question was, which timeline was real? And the answer to that question was in the September inventory she was about to begin. She counted everything. She walked the claim with the notebook for a full week and counted trees in the draw and grass on the slopes and hours of daylight remaining before the first frost and the weight her horse could pull on the drag chain and the number of nails she had in the barn and the number she would need to buy at Fort Benton. She calculated the outer wall in the specific detail of a woman who was building something she had seen built, but had never built herself, a woman who was translating a 400-year-old Scottish technique from stone and peat to pinon and prairie grass, and who understood that the translation had to be exact in principle, even where it was different in material. She needed 37 posts for the 4 walls of the cabin, 11 along the south, 9 along the north, 10 along each of the east and west, but she would cut 44/7 extras against loss or splitting or defect, because a woman building alone in January could not afford to discover that a post was cracked after the Chinook had passed. 64 horizontal rails, 200 sheathing boards, hundreds of pounds of dried grass. She needed a post hole iron heavy enough for January ground and nails stored warm enough to survive February cold. She needed 4 months of preparation for 1 day of post setting because the post required the ground to be soft, and the ground would be soft only during the Chinook, and the Chinook lasted 1 day. Perhaps 2. She had never seen it last 3. She wrote the numbers in the notebook and sat at the table and looked at them. The numbers were large. The numbers were the work of one woman with 1 horse over 4 months, and if she fell behind on any single item, the entire schedule collapsed because the schedule was sequential and each item depended on the one before it. Cut the posts before the hauling season ended. Cut the rails before the first snow. Rip the boards before her arms gave out. Collect the grass before the wind scattered it. Mark the post positions before the ground froze. Every task feeding the next, and all of them feeding the single January day when the Chinook would give her the ground. She looked at the numbers for a long time. Then she turned the page and began writing the schedule day by day, September through December. Not because she was not afraid. She was afraid, but fear written into a schedule became steps, and steps could be walked, and walking was something she knew how to do. That night, she stood at the north wall of the cabin. She did not touch it. She stood a foot away and felt the cold radiating from the logs, the cold of a September evening that was not yet winter, that was merely a preview of what December would bring. She did not need to put her hand on the wood. She could feel it from where she stood, the way you could feel a fire from across the room. This was the same but reversed. Not warmth reaching toward her, but cold. Cold reaching through 11 inches of pine as though the pine were not there. She spoke to the wall. She spoke in the Gaelic that was still her first language of precision and of feeling, the language she thought in when she was alone, the language that had come with her from Sutherland to Montana, and that the Montana winter had not frozen out of her. She said, "I am going to bury you inside another wall." It sounded like a threat. It was not a threat. It was architecture. But the word she used was the same word, bury, and it carried the weight of the other burying she had done that spring beside the Judith River, and she heard the weight in her own voice, and she did not take it back. She closed the door. She went to the table and opened the notebook to the September schedule. Tomorrow she would begin cutting posts in the draw. 44 posts, 6 inches in diameter, 6 feet 2 inches long. 4 days of felling, 3 days of trimming, a week of hauling, and then the rails, and then the boards, and then the grass, and then the waiting, and then the day. She put her hand on the first page of the schedule and pressed it flat against the table. The paper was thin beneath her palm. The work was not. The saw blade was 8 inches from her face when the counterweight rope snapped. It was the 8th day of board ripping, the 14th of October, and Margaret had been working the frame saw since 6 in the morning with the spring pole method her father had used for solo sawing in Sutherland. A young sapling bent under tension tied to the upper end of the saw blade, providing the upstroke while she drove the downstroke with her arms and her weight. The technique was slower than 2 people sawing and harder on the shoulders, but it produced the same cut, and it did not require a second person, and not requiring a second person was the criterion that governed every decision she made that autumn. The rope was hemp 3/8 of an inch, and it had been holding the sapling under tension for 8 days of continuous use. She had checked it each morning for fraying, running her thumb along the fibers, the way her father had taught her to check rigging, and on the morning of the 14th, she had checked it, and it had felt sound. It was not sound. At 11:20 in the morning on the downstroke of the 400 and something cut of the day, the rope parted at the friction point where it wrapped the sapling crown, and the released tension whipped the saw blade upward and sideways in the specific uncontrolled motion of a tool that has lost its counterbalance. The blade edge caught her left forearm 4 inches below the elbow. The cut was 4 inches long and deep enough to bleed freely, but not deep enough to reach the bone, and she knew this because she could still move her fingers and because the blood, while steady, was not pulsing. She sat down on the ground beside the saw frame. She pressed her right hand over the wound and held it there. The blood came through between her fingers, warm in the October morning air. She sat and bled and looked at the saw frame and at the broken rope hanging from the sapling and at the stack of boards. She had already cut 114 boards, 86 still to go, and she thought about Helen. She thought about Helen's voice in May, saying the specific sentence that Margaret had not been able to answer. "If you fall in the barn in January and break your leg, no one will know for a week. You will freeze to death on the barn floor and we will find you in March." The barn floor was not the saw frame, and January was not October, and a broken leg was not a cut forearm, but the principle was identical. She was alone. She was injured. If the blade had come 6 inches higher and 6 inches to the right, it would have opened her throat, and she would have bled out on the ground beside the saw frame in the October sun, and Duncan would have found her when he came to check before winter, and that would have been the end of the wall, and the claim and the 400 years of knowledge she carried in her memory from Sutherland. She sat for 15 minutes. She sat not because of the pain, which was manageable, but because she was having a conversation with herself that she needed to finish before she stood up. The conversation was about Helen. Helen had been right, not right about leaving, right about the problem. The problem was not cold, and it was not strength, and it was not will. The problem was that a single point of failure in a system with no redundancy was not a plan. It was a gamble, and Margaret was not a gambler. She was an engineer, and engineers built redundancy into systems because engineers understood that things broke. She stood up. She went to the cabin and cleaned the wound with water she had boiled that morning and wrapped it with a strip of linen torn from the sheet she kept for bandaging. The wrapping was tight enough to stop the bleeding and loose enough to let her flex her wrist. She went back to the saw frame and retied the counterweight rope with a doubled line, testing the knot 3 times before resuming the cut. She finished the day's work with her left forearm throbbing under the bandage, and she finished it because the schedule did not have room for a day lost to an injury that still allowed her to grip the saw handle. But the next morning before she went to the saw frame, she did something she had not planned. She took a piece of red cloth from the rag bin, a square of faded calico the size of her hand, and she tied it to the gatepost at the front of the claim. The cloth hung at eye level, visible from the trail that ran east toward Duncan's land. She tied it with a knot that could be undone and retied daily because she intended to tie it every morning and untie it every night, and the system was this. If the red cloth was on the post, she was working. She was alive and on her feet, and the day was proceeding. If the red cloth was not on the post, something had happened. She wrote it in the notebook that evening, beneath the lines she had written in September about the problem Helen had raised. She wrote solution red cloth on gatepost. Hang every morning. If not hanging, come immediately. Tell Duncan to check when passing. It was not the same as having someone in the barn with her. It was not the same as 2 people on a claim, but it was the redundancy that the system required, the signal that turned 3 miles of empty basin into a connection rather than an absence. Helen had been right about the problem. Margaret had found the answer to the problem. The answer was not leaving. The answer was a piece of red calico on a gatepost, and it was the first time since Alistair died that she had built someone else into her plan. The autumn deepened. She ripped boards through the rest of October, the doubled counterweight line, holding without incident her left forearm healing beneath the bandage, in the slow way that wounds healed when the body was working 12 hours a day and could not spare much energy for repair. By the end of October, she had cut all 200 boards and had begun stacking them in the barn face side down to prevent weathering, numbered by wall. In the sequence, she would nail them. South wall first, then north, then east, then west. Every board in its place, every place determined by the January day that had not yet come. The Reverend James Whitfield arrived on a Tuesday in the last week of October, riding the circuit he made through the basin settlements 4 times a year, bringing scripture and news and the particular comfort of a man who believed that God's plan for the suffering was not more suffering but surrender to a better arrangement. He was a kind man. Margaret did not doubt his kindness. She doubted his understanding of the difference between surrender and strategy, but she did not doubt his kindness. He sat at her table and drank the coffee she offered and looked at her hands, which were blistered across both palms from the saw and the axe and the hauling chain. He looked at the bandage on her left forearm, which was still wrapped, though the wound had mostly closed. He looked at the stacks of timber visible through the south window, the organized piles of posts and rails and boards that had appeared around the cabin since September. He looked at these things, and Margaret watched him look, and she knew what he was going to say before he said it. He said, "Mrs. Thornton, the Lord does not ask us to carry what we cannot bear alone." Margaret said, "What kind of help are you offering, Reverend?" He said there was a family in Fort Benton, the Hendersons' good people church-going, who had a spare room and who would welcome her for the winter months. She could return to the claim in spring. The arrangement would cost her nothing. The church would see to it. Margaret nodded. She said, "If I leave for the winter, the cabin deteriorates. Mice get in, snow loads the roof, and if a beam cracks, there is no one here to shore it up. The chinking fails in the freeze-thaw cycle, and by spring the gaps are wide enough to put your hand through. A claim needs someone on it through the winter, Reverend. That is not stubbornness. That is maintenance." Whitfield listened. He was a man who listened well, which was part of what made him good at his work and part of what made him difficult to dismiss. He listened, and then he said, "Pride is not the same as wisdom, Mrs. Thornton." Margaret looked at him for a long moment. She could have been angry. She was not angry because Whitfield was partly right in the way that people who care about you are sometimes partly right and entirely wrong at the same time. Pride and wisdom were not the same. But what she was doing was neither pride nor wisdom. It was calculation. She had calculated, and the answer was the wall. And the wall required her to be here. And being here required her to survive. And surviving required the red cloth on the gatepost, and the counterweight line doubled, and the nails stored indoors, and every other precaution she could engineer into the system. She said, "Reverend, do you know about the black houses in Scotland?" He did not. She said, "The Highland people have been building double-walled houses for 400 years. My father built them. I grew up in one. I am not staying because of pride. I am staying because I know how to build something that will make this cabin livable, and I cannot build it from Fort Benton." Whitfield looked at her, and for the first time in the conversation, his expression changed from concern to something else. Not belief exactly, but curiosity. The curiosity of a man who had expected to find a widow in denial and had found instead a woman with a plan she was not sharing the details of, and the not sharing was not evasion but economy, because explaining the technical specifics of double-wall insulation to a traveling minister would not convince him and would only make him worry in a more complicated way. He left with a promise to pray for her. She said, "Pray for warm weather on one day in January, Reverend. That would be more useful." She said it with the first trace of humor she had felt since April, and Whitfield smiled despite himself, and then he was gone. He was not entirely gone. Margaret learned in November through Helen that Whitfield had stopped at Duncan's claim on his way back to Fort Benton and had said to Duncan that your brother's wife is going to freeze this winter if someone does not intervene. Your brother's wife, not Margaret, not Mrs. Thornton. Your brother's wife, a woman defined by a dead man's relation to a living one, as though her name had been buried with Alistair, and what remained was only the connection. It was the only time since April that Margaret felt true anger. Not the slow burn of frustration. Anger, the heat of it in her face and her hands, the specific anger of a woman who had been made invisible in a sentence spoken about her to someone else. She did not ride to Fort Benton and confront Whitfield because the ride was 30 miles and November was not a month for 30-mile rides made in anger, but she remembered the sentence. She kept it in the same place she kept the inventory in the part of her mind where information was stored not for sentiment, but for use. The sentence was useful because it told her exactly what she was to the world outside the claim. She was your brother's wife. She was the unnamed widow on the Judith. She was the problem that kind men discussed with other men on the road between settlements. The wall would change what she was. The wall was the answer not only to the cold, but to the sentence. Duncan came in early November before the deep cold set in. He came because he had promised Alistair, and he came because Whitfield's words had put a new kind of weight on the promise. He stood in the cabin and looked at the timber stacked around the exterior, and at the numbered boards in the barn, and at the red cloth on the gatepost that he had noticed as he approached, but had not understood. Margaret explained the cloth. She explained it briefly the way she explained everything, which was with the facts and without the feelings behind the facts. She said, "If the cloth is not on the post, come immediately." He nodded. He looked at the cloth, and she could see him understanding what it meant, not as a signal, but as an admission. She had admitted she could be hurt. She had admitted she was alone. She had admitted these things not to him, but to the gatepost and the calico, and the admission was in the system now built in part of the plan. Then he asked about the timber. He said, "What are you building with all this wood?" She told him. A second outer wall, cavity between the walls packed with dried grass. She told him in 2 sentences because 2 sentences were enough for the concept and because the details were hers and not yet ready for sharing. Duncan listened. He did not ask about the technique or the materials or the schedule. He asked the question that mattered to him, the question that came from the place where his brother's death still lived. He said all of this, alone. She said alone. He was quiet for a long time, standing in the middle of the cabin with his coat still on, because the cabin was 50 degrees and 50 degrees was not a room where you removed your coat. Then he said something that Margaret had not expected and that changed the temperature of the conversation more than any wall would change the temperature of the room. He said, "My brother died working alone on the cut bank. I was 3 miles away and I did not know until the next evening." He stopped. He looked at the floor and then at her. He said, "I cannot do that twice, Margaret." She heard it. She heard the thing beneath the words, which was not an objection to her plan, but a confession of his own failure. Duncan had been 3 miles away when Alistair died. 3 miles was close enough to help and far enough to be useless, and he had been carrying that distance in his chest for 7 months. He was not asking her to stop building. He was asking her to not die while building, and the asking was as close as Duncan came to saying the thing he could not say directly, which was that he had failed Alistair by being 3 miles away, and he could not bear to fail her the same way. Margaret looked at him. She looked at the coat he had not taken off and at the hands that were her husband's hands, the same broad fingers and the same scarred knuckles, the family resemblance that she had to look away from sometimes, because it put Alistair in the room when Alistair was not in the room, and the absence was worse with his hands visible on someone else. She said, "The red cloth on the gate, every morning I hang it. If you do not see it come, that is how you do not do it twice." He looked at the gate post through the window. He looked at the red cloth. He nodded. It was slow and it was not complete agreement, but it was recognition that she had thought about the thing he feared and had built a response to it. Not a perfect response, not the response he wanted, which was for her to not be alone at all, but a response, and responses were what engineers built when perfect solutions did not exist. He said one more thing before he left. He said, "Helen wanted me to bring you back with me." Margaret said, "I know." Duncan said, "I will tell Helen about the cloth." Margaret said, "Thank you." It was the first time she had thanked anyone since Alistair died. The word came out with a weight that surprised her, the weight of a woman who had been so careful about not asking for anything that the act of receiving even a small thing, even the agreement to watch for a piece of red cloth, felt like a door opening that she had kept deliberately shut. She said thank you, and she meant it in all the ways it could be meant. And Duncan heard at least some of them, because he paused at the door and looked back at her with an expression she could not read, and then he walked the 3 miles home. At the end of November, Thomas Garner came again. He came with paper, this time a written offer, handwritten in careful script with a specific dollar amount. He said, "First snow has already come. I wanted to make sure you had this before the roads close." Margaret took the paper and read it. The amount was higher than she had expected, substantially higher enough to buy a small house in Fort Benton and live modestly for several years. Garner had calculated the offer to be exactly large enough to make refusal feel irrational, the specific financial pressure of a number that solved every problem except the one she cared about, which was the claim itself. She folded the paper and set it on the table. She said, "I will keep this through the winter, Mr. Garner. If I change my mind, you will know in the spring." He looked at the timber stacked outside. He said, "Building a fence." She said something like that. He nodded and rode west. After he left, she looked at the folded paper on the table for a long time. Then she placed her notebook on top of it, covering it. The paper lay beneath the notebook for the rest of the winter, face down, the written amount hidden. It was there every morning when she opened the notebook to check the schedule. She never turned it over, but she knew the number. She brought the post hole iron to Cormac Finch at the Fort Benton smithy in the last week of November. Finch was a former soldier, 55 years old, with hands that had been shaping iron for 30 years, and eyes that measured everything they looked at, including the woman standing in his shop with a post hole iron that she wanted modified for frozen ground. She told him what she needed: additional weight in the socket, 2 pounds, to increase the impact force for soil that had been frozen and compressed. He asked what she was digging in January. She said frozen ground partially thawed. He asked how deep. She said 30 inches. He looked at the iron and he looked at her and he added 3 pounds instead of 2 without asking permission, because a man who had spent 30 years shaping iron understood that the person requesting the modification usually underestimated the resistance. And a woman digging 30-inch holes in January ground needed every advantage the iron could give her. Before she paid him, he said something that was not a warning and not a discouragement, but was the specific honesty of a man who respected the work enough to tell the truth about it. He said, "I have seen men break their backs with post-hole irons in frozen ground. Good men, young men." He paused. "If you hit rock at 20 inches, the iron will not tell you it is rock until your arms already know." It was the first time anyone had spoken to her about the work itself rather than about whether she should be doing it. Helen had spoken about safety. Duncan had spoken about loss. Whitfield had spoken about awe. Garner had spoken about money. Finch spoke about rock at 20 inches, and the speaking was a kind of respect she had not received from anyone else, the respect of a man who assumed she was going to do the work and wanted her to do it without breaking. She wrote in the notebook that evening, "If rocket 20, shift the hole 4 inches east and try again." The note was Finch's advice translated into procedure, and procedure was how she survived. After she left the smithy, Finch said to his apprentice, "That woman is either going to build something nobody has seen before, or she is going to kill herself trying. Either way, I want to see the result." The apprentice asked what she was building. Finch said, "I do not know. But whatever it is, she has been thinking about it longer than she has been talking about it, and in my experience, that is the kind of building that works." December was the longest month. Everything that could be prepared had been prepared. The posts stood in ordered ranks beside the south wall, protected from rain and snow by the roof overhang. The rails lay stacked behind the posts, organized by wall in the sequence of use. The boards filled the barn, face down, numbered. The grass, enormous quantities of it harvested from the south-facing slopes in October, lay in loose piles in the barn, curing, releasing the last of its moisture into the cold, dry air. The nails sat in their wooden box inside the cabin, where the warmth kept them from becoming brittle. The heavy post-hole iron leaned against the wall beside her bed. Everything was ready. Nothing was happening. The Chinook had not come. She checked the thermometer every morning at 6. The numbers were brutal. 28 below, 31 below, 26 below, 33 below. The cold had arrived in late November and had settled over the basin with the permanence of something that intended to stay, and December passed in the specific silence of a world that had frozen and would not move again until the air from the southwest arrived and broke the lock. If the air arrived, if the Chinook came. 3 winters of evidence said it would. 3 was a small number for a bet this large. She rationed her certainty the way she rationed her wood. She allowed herself to believe the Chinook would come, but she did not allow herself to believe it with the part of her mind that made plans, because planning for certainty was how people were destroyed by uncertainty. She planned for the Chinook, and she also planned for the absence of the Chinook. And on a night in late November, on a page at the back of the notebook, she had written the contingency. If the Chinook does not come, build in March, when the ground thaws naturally. The March plan was worse because March ground was mud, and mud did not hold posts the way thawed, frozen ground held posts. And because March was late, and late meant another month of 50-degree nights and the woodpile shrinking. But March was possible. March was the backup. The backup existed so that January could be the plan. The waiting was the hardest part. Harder than the cutting, harder than the hauling, harder than the ripping of 200 boards on a frame saw with a spring pole. Those had been work, and work had a rhythm, and rhythm carried you through the hours without requiring you to think about what you were feeling. December had no work. December had only the maintenance of animals and fire and self, and the hours between the maintenance were long and silent and full of the kind of thinking that a busy woman does not do and that an idle woman cannot avoid. She thought about Alistair. She thought about him more in December than she had in any month since April, because in the months between she had been working, and the work had occupied the space where grief would otherwise sit. Now the space was empty, and the grief sat down in it and stayed. The 19th of December was the worst night, 35 below. The coldest temperature Margaret had recorded in 3 winters. The stove was at full rate, consuming wood at the pace that frightened her every winter, the pace that reminded her that the wall between her and death was measured not in inches of pine, but in cords of firewood. The thermometer inside the cabin read 42 degrees. She sat in the chair beside the stove, wrapped in everything she owned, and she felt the cold coming through every surface in the room. The north wall, the west wall, the floor, the roof. The cold did not come from one direction. It came from everywhere simultaneously, a pressure from outside that the cabin could resist but could not defeat. And on this night, the resistance was failing. She did something she had not done since June. She reached beneath the notebook and turned over Garner's paper. She read the number. She looked at it for 3 minutes by the clock on the shelf. She let herself imagine. A house in Fort Benton with brick walls and a coal stove and neighbors on both sides and the sound of other people's voices through the walls. A house where 42 degrees at midnight was not a possibility. A house where the thermometer was a curiosity rather than a verdict. 3 minutes. She looked at the number for 3 minutes. Then she turned the paper face down again and placed the notebook on top of it. She turned it over not because of will, not because of pride, not because of the wall or the plan or the 400 years of knowledge from Sutherland. She turned it over because she looked up from the paper and saw through the south window in the moonlight the posts standing in their ordered ranks beside the cabin wall. 44 posts cut and trimmed and hauled and stacked. 200 boards ripped and numbered. 64 rails, the heavy iron by the bed. 4 months of labor standing in the cold waiting for the day. To quit now was not to lose to the winter. To quit now was to say that 4 months had been wrong. That September had been wrong. That the notebook and the schedule and the sew and the iron and the red cloth on the gatepost and the bandage on her arm and every calculation she had made since the morning she rose from the ground beside Alistair's grave had been wrong. And she did not believe she had been wrong. She believed the winter was stronger than she had hoped. She believed 42 degrees was colder than she wanted. She did not believe she was wrong. She put the notebook back on the paper and she went to bed. On Christmas night, she opened the notebook and found on the last page a line she did not remember writing. If the Chinook does not come build in March when the ground thaws. She stared at the line. She had written a backup for her backup on some sleepless night she could not recall, and the existence of that line meant that even in the dark, even in the cold, even in the part of the night when the mind cannot hold its shape, she had been planning. Not hoping, planning. The distinction mattered more than warmth. She laughed. It was a small sound in the 42-degree room, a sound that had not been in the cabin since April, and it startled her the way a sudden noise startles you in a quiet house. She laughed because the line in the notebook was proof that she was who she thought she was, even at 3 in the morning, even in December. And then she closed the notebook and went back to bed. January arrived. The cold held. The 1st of January, the 5th, the 8th. The thermometer gave her nothing. 29 below, 30 below, 32 below. She checked it each morning at 6 with the discipline of a woman who had stopped hoping for a specific number and was simply recording, because recording was what you did when you could not act, and acting would come when the air changed. On the night of January 13th, the air changed. She was lying in bed at 10:30 and she smelled it before she felt it. The faint softness, the loosening, the mineral absence of the deep cold giving way to something that had moisture in it, something that had traveled from the southwest across the mountains and down into the basin, and the smell was the smell of a door opening after a room has been sealed for 3 weeks. She got up. She went to the cabin door and opened it and stood in the doorway for 5 minutes, pressing the air with her nose, the way her father had pressed the peat, with his hand testing, measuring, reading the information that the air was giving her. She said tomorrow. She went back inside. She lay in bed and she did not sleep. She heard the cabin timbers make a sound they had not made in weeks, a faint ticking and settling. Not the contraction of extreme cold, but the expansion of warming wood, the structure finding a new dimension as the temperature outside began to climb. She ran the plan through her mind one final time. South wall first, clockwise around the cabin, 37 holes. The iron by the bed 3 pounds heavier than standard Finch's modification. The spade for clearing. The maul for tamping. Start at 6, finish before the air changes back. The heavy iron was leaning against the wall beside the bed. She reached out in the dark and put her hand on it. The iron was cold. Everything in the cabin was cold. But tomorrow the ground would be soft enough to receive it, and soft ground lasted 1 day, and 1 day was all she had asked for. She lay in the dark with her hand on the cold iron, and she spoke to the room. She said one day, "That is all I need." At 6 in the morning on January 14th, the thermometer outside the south window read 31 degrees, 31 above zero. The ground would be soft today and only today. She did not eat breakfast. She dressed in everything she owned. She walked to the door. She paused. She walked back and picked up the red cloth from the hook where she kept it at night. She went outside into the 31-degree morning and tied the cloth to the gatepost. Today, more than any other day, the cloth mattered. If she broke her arm on the 5th hole, the winter was over. The cloth was the thread between her and the possibility of rescue. She tied it with the knot that could be undone and retied, and she pulled it tight, and she walked to the barn to get the iron. She pressed the iron into the ground beside the south foundation at 6:12 in the morning, and the iron went in 2 inches and stopped. The top layer was hard compressed and cemented by 3 weeks of freeze and thaw, and the iron met it the way a chisel meets seasoned oak, with resistance at the surface and the promise of something softer beneath. She raised the iron above her head and drove it down with the full weight of her arms and her shoulders in the specific determination of a woman who had spent 4 months waiting for this ground to let her in. 4 inches. She raised it again. 6 inches. The sound of the iron meeting the frozen soil was a flat, dense thud, a sound without echo, a sound that went into the ground and stayed there. The first post hole took 40 minutes. 30 inches deep, 8 inches wide, the dimension she had decided in September and had not revisited because revisiting a correct decision was a waste of time she did not have. At 18 inches, the soil changed. The iron, which had been fighting through compressed cold, hardened earth, suddenly moved more freely, passing into the layer below the frost line where the temperature was constant and the freeze had not reached. She felt the change in her arms before she understood it in her mind, the way you feel a locked door give before you hear the latch release. The last 12 inches went quickly. She cleared the hole with the spade, checked the depth against the mark she had filed into the iron handle in December, and set the first post. The post was one of the 44 she had cut in September from the draw timber, 6 inches in diameter at the base, trimmed and dried and stacked beside the cabin wall for 4 months. She lowered it into the hole and tamped it with the maul, driving it down until the base of the post met the bottom of the hole, and the post stood 4 feet 8 inches above the frozen ground level with the existing cabin wall height. She tamped until the soil around the base was compressed and the post did not move when she pushed it with both hands. She stepped back. One post, 37 to go. The sun was barely above the eastern ridge. She moved 2 feet east along the south wall and started the second hole. The first hole had taught her the ground. She knew the resistance profile now, the way the top 6 inches fought and the middle 12 inches yielded and the bottom 12 inches welcomed the iron. The second hole took 25 minutes. The third took 20. By the fifth hole, she had found the rhythm, and the rhythm was this: 15 heavy overhead blows to break the surface crust. Steady, alternating blows for the middle layer, the iron rising and falling in a metronomic pattern that she could sustain without thinking about it. Then the spade to extract the loosened material. Then the iron again for the final depth. Then the spade to clear to the 30-inch mark. Then the post. Then the maul. Then 2 feet east and start again. The ninth hole she hit rock. The iron struck something at 22 inches that was not soil and was not ice. The impact traveled through the iron handle and into her wrists, and she knew immediately what it was. She pulled the iron out and shifted 4 inches to the east. Finch had been right. She started the hole again, and the rock was not there. The shifted hole went to 30 inches without obstruction, but the delay had cost her 15 minutes, and 15 minutes was not a quantity she could afford to lose. She set the post and moved on without pausing. By noon, she had 17 posts in the ground along the south wall and had started the north wall. She had not eaten. She had not stopped moving except to drink water from the canteen she had hung on the south wall gatepost at 6 that morning, the water that had been warm at 6 and was now cold but not frozen, which told her the temperature was still above freezing, which told her the Chinook was still holding. The north wall was slower. The north side of the cabin had been in shadow all morning, the low January sun tracking across the southern sky without reaching the ground along the north foundation. The shadow had kept the soil colder and the frost line was deeper. She found the soft layer at 22 inches instead of 18.8 inches of additional frozen earth that the iron had to break through, and each hole took an additional 10 minutes. She adjusted. She set the north post at 22 inches of burial instead of 30, the reduced depth compensated by the cross timber braces she had planned in November, horizontal members connecting each north post to the cabin foundation log, at ground level transferring the lateral load from the shallow post to the existing structure. The 22 inches was sufficient for the vertical load. The cross timber would manage the lateral force. She had thought about this in November. She had written it in the notebook. She had planned the contingency the way she planned everything, which was before it was needed. At 2 in the afternoon, she finished the north wall post and started the east wall. The east wall was faster than the north, the morning shadow having retreated. As the sun moved west, the ground softer on the east face than it had been on the north. At 3:45, she was on the west wall, the last wall, the shortest face 8 posts. Her arms were operating on a fuel that was not food and was not rest and was something she could not have named, but that she recognized from the stories her father had told about the men who built the harbor wall at Tongue in a single tide, the men who had 12 hours and no more, and who found in the 12th hour a strength that the first hour had not known about. She drove the last post at 4:20. She tamped it with the maul. She pushed it with both hands. It did not move. She stepped back and looked at what she had built. 37 vertical timbers standing in the frozen ground around the cabin, 4 feet 8 inches above the surface, plumb and solid spaced at 2-foot intervals forming a perimeter, 6 to 8 inches outside the existing log walls. They stood in the late afternoon light of a January day that was already ending, the sun low and red on the western ridge, the temperature beginning its descent back toward the cold that had held the basin for 3 weeks, and that would hold it again by midnight. She looked at them. She did not speak. There was no one to speak to, and the posts did not require words. They required only what they had, which was the ground beneath them and the wall they would carry, and the 4 months of preparation that had put them exactly where they stood. 37 posts. One day. She went inside. She ate the food she had left on the table at 6 that morning when she had not eaten breakfast. She ate without tasting the food going in, as fuel, not as pleasure, the body receiving what it needed in order to do tomorrow what it had done today. She drank the cold coffee. She sat for 20 minutes in the chair by the south window and felt her arms, the specific heaviness of 14 hours of overhead work with a weighted iron. The heaviness was not pain. Pain was sharper and more specific. This was the feeling of muscles that had given everything they had and were now settling into the quiet that came after the giving, the quiet that would become stiffness by morning and would not fully leave her for a week. She went to bed at 7:30 earlier than she had gone to bed since childhood. At 11 that night, she woke to the sound of the temperature dropping. It was a sound she could not have described to anyone who had not spent winters in a log cabin in Montana, the specific sound of the cold returning after a warm spell. The timbers contracting as the temperature fell, producing a series of small pops and ticks in the roof joints. In the wall corners, the cabin finding its cold weather dimensions again, shrinking slightly, tightening the wood, remembering the shape it held at 30 below. She had heard this sound at the end of every Chinook for 3 winters. It was the sound of a door closing. She got up and checked the thermometer. 19 degrees and dropping. She looked through the south window. The posts were there, visible in the moonlight, standing exactly where she had put them. She said one word, "Good." She went back to bed. The next morning, the temperature was 17 below zero. The ground was locked again. But 37 posts were in it, and the ground could not give them back. She built the south wall first, beginning on the 2nd of February. The temperature was 12 below, and the hammer handle was cold enough to burn bare skin, and she worked in the rhythm. That cold weather demanded mittens off for 2 swings of the hammer, mittens on for 5 seconds, mittens off for 2 more swings. The pattern repeating through the hours in the specific cadence of a body negotiating with an environment that punished every exposed surface. She nailed the first horizontal rail to the posts at 6 inches above the ground, then the second rail at 24 inches, the third at 42, the fourth at the wall plate height. 4 rails forming the frame of the outer wall. Then the sheathing boards, the 1-inch rough cut boards she had ripped in October, nailed vertically from bottom to top in the shiplap pattern, each board overlapping the one below by an inch. She packed as she went. This was the sequence she had determined in September. Nail a course of boards, then fill the cavity behind the completed course with dried grass before nailing the next course above. The grass packing was done with the flat-bladed paddle she had carved from a plank in November, working the paddle in a figure-8 motion that distributed the grass evenly through the full width of the cavity and compressed it to the density she was looking for, the density where the paddle met significant resistance and the individual stalks were pressed against each other in full contact, and the spaces between them were too small for air to move through. She packed until the paddle told her the fill was correct. She did not measure the density with an instrument. She measured it with the paddle and with her hands, the diagnostics she trusted above all others. On the second day, a nail cracked on the third blow. She looked at it and knew immediately what had happened. She had left a handful of nails on the rail beside her for convenience, and the nails had been sitting in 12 below air for an hour, and the cold had made them brittle. The nails stored inside the cabin in the wooden box she had placed by the stove in December were warm and flexible. The nails she had carried outside and left exposed were frozen and fragile. She had planned for this. She had stored the nails indoors precisely to prevent this. And then she had broken her own rule for the sake of saving 30 seconds, and the broken nail was the cost of 30 seconds of convenience. She swept the cold nails off the rail and went inside for warm ones and did not make the mistake again. The south wall took 4 days. On the morning of February 7th, she stood inside the cabin and placed her right palm flat against the inner face of the south logs. She held it there. The logs were warm, not the warmth of the stove. A different warmth, the warmth of wood that had been protected from the outside cold all-night wood that had been insulated by 6 inches of packed grass and a second wall of pine boards wood that was reflecting the room's heat back into the room instead of conducting it outward into the Montana February. She held her hand there for a full minute. She said in the Gaelic that was still her first language of surprise and precision, the sin nasfiar. That is better. Then she walked to the north wall and placed her left palm against the inner face of the north logs. Cold. The cold she had been living with for 3 winters, the cold of uninsulated pine at 12 below outside. She stood in the center of the cabin between her 2 hands, right hand on the warm south wall, left hand on the cold north wall, and the difference between the walls was in her 2 palms simultaneously, not in a notebook, not in a thermometer, but in her own body. This was the only measurement she needed. This was the measurement that 400 years of Highland builders had used before thermometers existed, the measurement that her father had used when he pressed his hand against the black house walls and knew by feel whether the cavity was packed correctly. The instrument was the hand. The hand did not lie. She spent the next 4 days measuring instead of building. She had planned to start the north wall immediately, but the south wall had produced a result she had not predicted in its magnitude. The room temperature at the same stove rate and in approximately the same outdoor cold had risen from 50 to 57 degrees. 7 degrees from one wall. She had estimated 4 based on the south wall being 1/4 of the total envelope. The south wall was giving more than its share. It took her 2 days to understand why, and when she understood it, she sat at the table and pressed her pen against the notebook page hard enough to leave a mark before writing the first word. The south wall received the low February sun directly, and the packed cavity held the day's warmth and released it slowly through the night. The old single wall had gained and lost in equal measure, the net being 0. The new wall held the gain and resisted the loss, and the difference was 7 degrees from one wall. She wrote the numbers, and then she sat and looked at them, and what she felt was not pride, but the particular satisfaction of a woman whose father had been right about something 40 years ago and 6,000 miles away, and she was only now proving it with a thermometer in Montana. She revised the plan. The north wall, which had no solar gain, needed a deeper cavity, 8 inches instead of 6. The north wall's only function was preventing cold transmission, and it needed more depth to do that single function well. She had set the north post at 8 inches from the log face in anticipation of this possibility, though she had not known the exact number until the south wall told her. She revised the west wall to 9 inches. The west wall was the wind wall, the wall that took the full force of the northwest winter wind, and wind carried cold faster than still air at the same temperature, which meant the wind wall needed the deepest cavity and the most resistance. She wrote a note in the margin of the notebook beside the temperature record. It was written for herself and for whoever read the notebook after her. Wall thickness is not uniform. Match the cavity to the exposure. South faces the sun, 6 inches is right. North faces the cold, 8 inches. West faces the wind, 9 inches. East is sheltered, 6 inches is enough. Adjust for your cabin's specific location. The principle is the same. The cavity depth is yours to decide. She looked at the note. Then she added below it, my father knew this. He did not explain it. He built the walls, and I lived in them. Now I know it too. She built the north wall in the second week of February. The hardest wall, the coldest wall, the wall that received the full force of the Canadian air coming down across the flat from the Rocky Mountain front. She packed the 8-inch cavity to the same density as the south, working in temperatures that made every motion deliberate and every nail a negotiation between the warm metal in her hand and the cold wood that did not want to receive it. The north wall was the wall where the work felt most like argument, the wall where the cold pushed back against everything she did, and she built it with the patience of a woman who understood that patience was not passive. Patience was doing the same correct thing repeatedly in conditions that made the doing difficult and not stopping because the difficulty was unpleasant. The north wall went up on February 14th. The room temperature climbed to 60 degrees. She built the east wall in the third week of February. The east wall was the gentlest wall, sheltered from the worst wind and the worst cold by the cabin's orientation and by the terrain east of the claim, a low ridge that broke the northeast wind before it reached the cabin. 6-inch cavity. The east wall went up quickly, almost easily, and the ease of it felt strange after the north wall's resistance, the way flat ground feels strange after a long climb. The east wall faced Duncan's land. She thought about this as she nailed the sheathing, the fact that the wall between her cabin and her brother-in-law's claim was the wall that needed the least protection. The land between them was sheltered. The wind did not come from that direction. The cold did not come from that direction. What came from that direction was Duncan walking 3 miles on a Tuesday morning in March, checking for a piece of red cloth on a gatepost. The east wall was the wall of connection, and it needed only 6 inches because connection was not the problem. The cold came from the other 3 directions, and she was building against those. The west wall was last. She built it in the final days of February and the first days of March. The wall that had defeated her, chinking every winter, the wall where she had heard the wind whispering through the gaps on the night of 35 below in December. 9 inches of cavity, the deepest of the 4 walls, the posts set 9 inches from the log face because the wind wall needed to absorb the full impact of the northwest gale before that wind reached the existing logs. She packed the 9-inch cavity with a fury she had not felt in the other walls, pressing the grass with the paddle until her shoulders ached, pressing until the cavity was so dense that the paddle barely moved because this wall was the wall that had been coldest for 3 winters. And this wall was where the chinking had failed every February. And this wall was the wall that had whispered to her at 3 in the morning on the worst night of her life in Montana, and she was sealing it shut. On the 5th of March, the cabin had 4 outer walls framing it, and 4 cavities packed with dried grass and 37 posts in the ground that had been put there in one day in January. She checked the thermometer, 63 degrees. Outside was 7 below. The stove at the same moderate rate it had been running since November. She opened the notebook. She wrote the record. Temperature before outer walls, 47 degrees average at the stove rate in January. Temperature after all 4 walls, 63 degrees average in February and March. Gained 16 degrees at same fuel. She wrote wood remaining approximately 4 cord. At January consumption rate, I would have had 1 cord remaining by March. At current consumption rate, 4 cord. 3 cords saved by the wall insulation. She underlined 3 cord. She wrote the walls paid for themselves in February. She looked at the temperature progression she had been recording since the south wall went up. Each wall adding to the previous, the successive layers compounding the 4th wall, completing the envelope in a way that the 3rd alone could not, because an envelope was a circuit, and a circuit was only as good as its weakest section. The west wall, the last wall completed, had produced the largest single jump in room temperature because the west wall had been the weakest section, the wall that let the wind through the chinking, the wall that had been the coldest surface for 3 winters. Sealing the weakest section produced the greatest gain. Her father had known this. She knew it now. Duncan came in March. He came not because she had asked him, but because he had been watching from 3 miles east since January, with the watchfulness of a man who had seen the cabin's outline change in February and who had wondered from a distance what the new wooden perimeter meant. The snow was passable in March and 3 miles was walkable, and he walked it on a Tuesday morning with the notebook he carried in his coat pocket and the specific curiosity of a man who had been thinking about 37 posts in the ground for 2 months. He knocked. She opened the door. The warmth hit him at the threshold, the way warmth from an open oven hits you when you open the kitchen door in winter. The immediate and unmistakable fact of a room that was warm when the world outside it was not. He came in and he took off his coat immediately without thinking, the automatic response of a body that recognized 63 degrees and did not need to be told what to do about it. In 3 years of visiting this cabin in winter, he had never removed his coat. He said "blath," warm, in the Gaelic. She said yes. He said how warm. She pointed to the thermometer. He looked at the number. He said 63. He looked at the stove. He looked at the wood box beside the stove, which was full. He looked back at her. She said the stove is at moderate rate, same as all winter. He said this is not a moderate rate room. She said it is now. She took him outside and walked him around the cabin and showed him the 4 walls. The posts and rails and sheathing boards, the structure she had built in the cold of February, the rough exterior that from a distance looked like a second cabin built around the first. She showed him the top of the south wall where the final course of boards had not yet been nailed flush, and he could look down into the cavity and see the packed grass pressing against the log face on one side and the board face on the other, the 6-inch space filled with compressed golden stalks. He pressed his hand into the top of the grass fill. The fill did not yield. He pressed harder. It resisted. He said grass. She said dried grass packed tight. He withdrew his hand and looked at it, at the impression the packed grass had left on his palm. He said, "Your father's black house." She looked at him. The look lasted longer than the sentence required because the sentence contained something she had not expected Duncan to know. He said, "Alistair told me before we came to Montana. He said your father built the black houses in Sutherland and that the walls were packed with turf." He paused. He said, "Alistair said you would find a way to build the same thing here." The silence that followed was the silence of a woman hearing her dead husband's voice through her dead husband's brother hearing something. Alistair had believed about her that he had never said to her, a belief he had carried privately and had shared only with Duncan, perhaps on the ship, perhaps on the Wagon West, perhaps on some evening in the first Montana winter when the cold was coming through the walls and Alistair knew it and said nothing to her, but said something to Duncan. He said she would find a way. He had known the wall was insufficient. He had known she knew. And he had believed that when the time came, she would solve it, not because he was too proud to solve it himself, but because he recognized that the knowledge was hers, not his, passed down from her father through the black houses of Sutherland, and the solving would come from the person who carried the knowledge. She said nothing for a moment. She said, "I use grass instead of turf. The grass is what there is here." He said, "And it works." She said, 16 degrees gained. Same stove rate. She paused. "The north cavity is 8 inches. Your cabin faces west. Your west cavity should be 8 inches also." He looked at her. He said, "You are already planning my cabin." She said, "I have been planning your cabin since February." She said it without heat as information. She said, "Your west wall's the cold wall at your location. I know where your post hole ground is soft in the creek draw. The Chinook comes in January. You have 9 months." He said, "You want me to prepare for 9 months for one day." She said, "The one day is the day that decides the rest. The preparation is what makes the one day sufficient." She paused. "I spent September through December preparing. The Chinook gave me one day, and one day was enough because everything else was ready." He was quiet. Then he asked, "Did Helen come to ask you to move in with us?" She said she did. He said, "And you said no." She said, "I did." He said, "Helen worried." She said, "I know. Tell Helen to come here. Tell her to put her hand on the north wall." Duncan understood. 63 degrees was the answer to Helen that no argument could have provided. Temperature was not a debate. Temperature was a fact, and facts did not require agreement. He wrote in his notebook. He wrote the post spacing in the rail heights, in the cavity depths by wall orientation, and the packing density, or rather the description of the packing density, which was not a number but a feeling, the resistance of the paddle when the fill was correct. She showed him the paddle and let him press it into the exposed top of the north cavity and feel what correct felt like. He pressed. He said this dense. She said this dense or slightly more. Too loose and it settles and leaves gaps and the cold finds the gaps. He put the notebook away. He stood at the cabin wall with his hand on the new outer boards, the boards that were cold at the surface because they were taking the weather, and behind them was warm air in the cavity, and behind that was warm logs. And behind that was 63 degrees. He said Alistair was right. She said, "About what?" He said you would find a way. She pressed her hand to the outer board. She said the black houses were never the same material twice. Sutherland used turf. The islands used seaweed. The Caithness coast used sand packed against brush. The material changes. The principle does not. He said the still air. She said yes. The still air. My father told me when I was 10. She paused. I did not understand it in the bone until I was standing at this cabin in September, with my hand on the north wall feeling what was going through it. He left at noon, walking the 3 miles east across the basin floor, with the notebook in his coat and the spacing in the notebook and the density in his hands and the temperature in his mind. 63 degrees in March at 7 below outside. She watched him go from the doorway until he was small against the brown winter grass of the basin. Then she stood in the doorway for another minute, not watching Duncan, but thinking about Alistair, about the conversation in February of 1866, when she had said the wall is the problem, and he had said the stove is too small. He had been wrong about the stove, but he had not been wrong about her. He had known, even while disagreeing with her about the method, that she would find the right one. The disagreement and the faith had lived in him at the same time, the way cold and warmth lived in the same cabin, now separated by a wall that made room for both. She had not known this about Alistair while he was alive. She was learning it from Duncan 8 months after Alistair's death, standing in a doorway at 63 degrees. The dead, it turned out, were still teaching. You simply had to build something large enough for the lesson to arrive through. In the middle of March, Thomas Garner came one last time. He rode in from the west on a morning when the temperature was 9 below and the sky was the pale, hard blue of late Montana winter. The blue that meant the cold was still present, but the season was beginning to loosen. He stopped at the gate and sat on his horse for a full minute, looking at the cabin, looking at the new outer walls, the rough pine boards and the post tops, and the changed shape of the structure, the shape of a building that had been wrapped in a second skin. He dismounted and tied his horse and walked to the door and knocked. Margaret opened the door. The warmth came out and Garner stood in it. His face registered the warmth the way Duncan's face had registered it, with surprise, though Garner's surprise had a different quality. Duncan's surprise had been the surprise of a man who believed his sister-in-law was capable and was seeing the proof. Garner's surprise was the surprise of a man who had made a calculation about a woman in the winter, and who was now standing in the evidence that his calculation was wrong. He said, "You built a second wall." She said, "Yes." He said, "All of it, yourself." She said, "Yes." He looked into the cabin. He looked at the stove burning quietly at moderate rate. He looked at the full wood box. He looked at the thermometer on the wall, though he was too far from it to read the number. He looked at all of it with the expression of a man revising a number in his head, the number he had assigned to the probability that Margaret Thornton would be standing at this door in March in a warm cabin with 4 cord of wood remaining and the claim intact. He said, "I suppose the offer is no longer relevant." Margaret went to the table. She picked up Garner's paper from beneath the notebook where it had lain face down since November. She carried it to the door and held it out to him. She said, "Thank you for the salt and flour last June, Mr. Garner." That was kind. Garner took the paper. He looked at it at the number he had written in November when he believed the winter would do his negotiating for him. He folded it and put it in his coat. He looked at the outer wall beside the door, at the boards and the posts in the visible top of the cavity fill. He stood there for a moment, and the moment had in it a quality that Margaret recognized because she had felt it herself in other circumstances, the quality of a man who was deciding what to say when the easy thing and the right thing were not the same. He said, "Your husband picked good land." Then he stopped. He looked at her. He said, "You picked good land." He mounted his horse and rode west. Margaret stood in the doorway and watched him go, and the correction he had made, the small revision from "your husband picked" to "you picked," was the first time since Alistair's death that anyone outside her family had spoken about the claim as hers. Not the widow's claim, not the Thornton claim. Hers. Margaret Thornton's land. The land she had stayed on and built for and survived. She went inside. The room was 63 degrees. She went to the stove and checked the fire and confirmed it was at moderate rate, the rate that had once produced 47 degrees and now produced 63, because the walls were doing what walls were supposed to do, which was hold the inside in and keep the outside out and not let the two confuse each other. She opened the notebook to the March page. She wrote March 5th. Duncan came, showed him the construction. He will build his outer walls next winter. Preparation begins September. He knows the south draw grass. She paused. She wrote, "Alistair said I would find a way." She looked at that line. She looked at it the way she had looked at Garner's number in December for a long time, reading what it contained. But this line did not make her imagine a different life. This line made her see the life she had, the life Alistair had believed she could make from the materials at hand. He had known. He had known before Montana. He had carried the knowledge of her capability the way she carried the knowledge of her father's walls, silently, without announcement, trusting that when the time came, the knowledge would do its work. She wrote beneath it, "The way was the black house. The black house was my father's. My father learned it from his father and his father before that. The Croft people in Sutherland have been building this wall for 400 years. I brought it to Montana in my memory and built it from different material, and it is the same wall." She turned to the last page of the notebook. She wrote the material changes. The principle does not. My father told me this when I was 10. I did not understand it in the bone until I was 46, standing at this wall, with my hand on the logs, feeling what was no longer going through them. She closed the notebook. She put it on the table on top of the place where Garner's paper had lain for 4 months. The paper was gone, now returned to the man who had written it, and the space beneath the notebook was empty, which was correct because the space had been holding a question, and the question had been answered. She put a log on the fire. She did not put it on because the room needed it. The room was 63 degrees, and 63 degrees did not need another log. She put it on because she had wood to spare. 4 cord of wood that the walls had saved for her by doing the work that wood had been doing alone for 3 years. The fire received the log and consumed it at the moderate rate. The rate that was now sufficient, the rate that had always been sufficient, if only the walls had been doing their part. She sat in the chair by the south window. The March light came in at a low angle, a winter angle still, but an angle that would be higher by April and higher still by May. The progression of a season turning its face in the right direction, beginning slowly, the way Montana springs always began, as if the land needed time to be sure of itself before committing to the warmth. She understood that. She had needed time herself, time to plan, time to cut, time to wait for the ground, time to build, time to see the number on the thermometer move from 47 to 63, and to know in her hands and in her bones that the number was real, and that the winter that would come again in October would find a different cabin than the one it had known. She sat in the 63-degree room. She let the fire do its work. She let the walls do theirs.